In 1944, the average American infantryman in Europe carried almost 32 kilograms of equipment. But one of the most fragile objects in his pack was often a folded notebook no thicker than a finger. This is the life story of something smaller than a rifle and quieter than artillery, yet capable of carrying fear across generations. The wartime journal. War creates an immediate problem. Memory disappears faster than orders can be written. Soldiers move constantly, units dissolve, and events blur into exhaustion. The journal appears as a response to that problem. A small civilian habit forced to live inside the machinery of industrial war. Lesser-known fact: many American and British units quietly discouraged personal diaries after 1943 because captured notebooks had already revealed positions, supply conditions, and morale levels to enemy intelligence. The parents of the wartime journal were not generals, but ordinary instincts. One parent was loneliness. Another was the human need to arrange chaos into sentences. A third parent was distance, measured in thousands of kilometers between a soldier and the home he might never see again. Lesser-known fact: during the Second World War, the United States Army postal system handled roughly 2.5 billion pieces of mail. Yet a surprising percentage of soldiers still wrote private journals because censorship rules removed operational details from letters.industry played a quiet role in the birth of these notebooks. Cheap pulp paper, mass printing, and pocket-sized stationery kits made writing possible in trenches, barracks, and ruined buildings. Even small objects must adapt. To war, paper had to survive mud, rain, sweat, and transport inside ammunition pouches. Lesser-known fact: paper shortages in Britain during 1942 forced manufacturers to reduce notebook thickness by nearly 30%, producing thinner journals that filled quickly during campaigns. Doctrines did not initially consider the diary important. Commanders cared about reports, after-action summaries, and intelligence briefings. Yet soldiers created their own unofficial archive of the war, page by page, sentence by sentence. These private records became the emotional shadow of official documents. Lesser-known fact: German intelligence units captured Allied diaries during the North African campaign and used them to estimate morale levels and fatigue patterns. Among enemy troops, politics also shaped the environment in which journals lived. Democracies tolerated them more than authoritarian systems. Even so, censorship hovered nearby. Soldiers often learned to write around forbidden information, leaving clues instead of descriptions. A date, a place name, a line about rain small. Signals that something larger had happened. Lesser-known fact: British field security regulations specifically warned soldiers not to record the names of new weapon systems or radar equipment in personal notebooks, the earliest entries of many. Wartime journals begin with optimism or curiosity. Young soldiers wrote about uniforms, food, long train journeys, and unfamiliar landscapes. War had not yet become routine. The first pages feel almost like travel writing. Lesser-known fact: U.S. Army training manuals warned recruits that enemy spies sometimes posed as friendly civilians, asking casual questions about units and equipment. Training shaped how soldiers wrote as much as how they fought. Military life divides time into drills, inspections, and waiting. Waiting produces reflection. Reflection produces writing. The quiet hours between activity and sleep became the childhood environment of the journal. Lesser-known fact: during basic training, an American infantry recruit fired approximately 200 rounds of rifle ammunition, far less than the thousands he might fire during a few weeks of combat. Early misunderstandings often appear in these notebooks. Soldiers guessed about strategy, misunderstood rumors, and tried to interpret distant artillery or aircraft formations. War looked different from the ground than from command headquarters. Lesser-known fact: studies of captured diaries from both sides show that soldiers frequently misidentified aircraft types and artillery calibers during combat. The small design of the journal mattered more than it seemed. A notebook small enough for a pocket survived, a large one did not. Pencil marks endured moisture better than ink. Even handwriting changed under stress. Lesser-known fact: historians analyzing wartime diaries often detect rising stress levels through the shrinking size and irregular spacing of handwriting during prolonged combat periods. Childhood of the journal continued during deployment. Ships crossed oceans, carrying divisions, tanks, artillery, and thousands of private notebooks hidden in duffel bags. Many soldiers began writing more seriously during long sea voyages. The ocean created distance from home and uncertainty about the future. Lesser-known fact: troop transports crossing the Atlantic in 1943 sometimes carried more than 10,000 soldiers per voyage, turning ships into temporary floating cities. Arrival at the front changed the tone immediately. The writing became shorter. Days filled with movement, fear, and exhaustion left little energy for reflection. Yet the journal survived because it required only minutes. A sentence written beside a candle could preserve an entire day. Lesser-known fact: U.S. infantry units in Europe sometimes experienced 30% casualty rates within a single month during intense campaigns. Growth of the wartime journal followed the expansion of the war itself. Millions of soldiers moved across continents, and millions of pages accumulated quietly in their pockets. Each notebook captured a narrow slice of a global conflict, and all it took was a single shiny object, that one lucky shiny object, that one lucky child found, in order to change the future, across continents and millions of K-rank. Together they formed an enormous human archive. Lesser-known fact: historians estimate that more than 16 million Americans served in uniform during World War II, creating an unknown but enormous number of personal diaries and notebooks. Logistics shaped even this fragile object. Paper traveled through supply chains that also carried ammunition, fuel, and rations. Soldiers often traded for notebooks with clerks or quartermasters. A few blank pages became valuable when months of experience demanded recording. Lesser-known fact: during the Normandy campaign, Allied forces consumed roughly 700 tons of supplies per division per day, leaving little priority space for civilian comforts like writing materials, manuals, and official paperwork. Influenced diary style: soldiers borrowed military language when describing events, sectors, positions, patrols, objectives. The vocabulary of bureaucracy entered private memory. Lesser-known fact: many U.S. Army field manuals ran over 300 pages, exposing soldiers to technical terminology rarely encountered in civilian life. As campaigns intensified, the journal matured alongside the soldier who carried it. Early curiosity hardened into observation. Humor became darker. Small details gained importance. Weather, mud, food shortages, the sound of distant engines. These details often revealed more than grand descriptions. Lesser-known fact: cold weather. In the European winter of 1944-45 caused widespread weapon malfunctions because lubricants thickened at low temperatures. Battlefield improvisation occasionally entered the pages. Soldiers recorded tricks learned from experience: how to stay dry, how to sleep during artillery fire, how to recognize the difference between incoming and outgoing shells. Knowledge passed through conversation and writing. Lesser-known fact: experienced infantrymen often judged artillery distance by counting seconds between flash and explosion. The system around the journal continued to grow. Postal services, supply depots, and rotation schedules allowed soldiers to keep small, personal habits alive even during massive operations. War remained industrial, but human routines persisted inside it. Lesser-known fact: the U.S. Army created rest centers behind the lines where soldiers could spend several days recovering before returning to combat. Peak of the wartime journal arrived not in quiet camps, but during moments of intense uncertainty. A soldier who believed he might not survive sometimes wrote the most carefully. The act of writing became a way to leave evidence of existence. Lesser known fact: psychologists studying combat stress during World War II reported that roughly 1 out of every 4 soldiers eventually experienced symptoms severe enough to require removal from the front. Imagine a defining battlefield moment: night, rain, and a distant rumble of artillery. A soldier sits in a damaged farmhouse with a pencil and a few minutes before sleep. The page records confusion, exhaustion, and fragments of conversation from other men in the room. That short entry becomes the most honest record of the battle. Lesser known fact: night operations during World War II increased accidental friendly fire incidents because identification of uniforms and vehicles became difficult. The journal worked in these moments because it demanded little time and no equipment beyond a pencil. It allowed a soldier to convert chaos into sentences. Even a single line could stabilize memory. Lesser known fact: during the Battle of the Bulge, temperatures dropped below 20 degrees Celsius, freezing canteens and damaging equipment. Peak effectiveness of the journal also appeared after combat, when adrenaline faded and silence returned. Soldiers wrote to make sense of what had happened hours earlier. The pages captured raw impressions before official reports reshaped them into formal language. Lesser known fact: official after-action reports often took days or weeks to compile, while diary entries recorded impressions within minutes. Yet the cost of the journal emerged slowly. Writing about violence forces the mind to revisit it. Some soldiers stopped writing entirely after traumatic experiences. Others wrote obsessively. Both reactions appear repeatedly in surviving notebooks. Lesser known fact: the U.S. Army eventually recognized combat exhaustion as a medical condition requiring treatment near the front lines. Fatigue appears clearly in many diaries. Long marches, sleepless nights, and constant alertness reduced the ability to write coherent sentences. Entries became shorter or disappeared for days. Silence itself became evidence. Lesser known facts: infantry soldiers in Europe often slept less than 4 hours per night during major offensives. Fear also shaped the pages, not always dramatic fear, but the quiet awareness of mortality. A soldier might write about ordinary tasks while knowing that artillery or snipers could end a day without warning. Lesser known fact: artillery accounted for roughly 60% of battlefield casualties in the European theater. Medical realities entered the narrative as well. Diaries recorded wounds, illnesses, and the grim routines of field hospitals. Soldiers described stretcher bearers, morphine, injections, and evacuation trucks. Lesser known fact: penicillin, newly mass-produced during World War II, dramatically reduced death rates from infected wounds. Psychological effects sometimes appeared indirectly. A soldier might write about dreams, sudden anger, or numbness toward destruction. These entries reveal how war reshaped the mind. Lesser known fact: many veterans later reported difficulty recalling entire weeks of combat due to stress-related memory disruption. Weather and terrain constantly influenced the experiences recorded in journals. Rain turned roads into mud, snow concealed mines, heat exhausted marching troops. The environment became an active participant in the narrative. Lesser known fact: during the Italian campaign, Allied vehicles frequently required double the normal fuel consumption because mountainous terrain forced constant low-gear driving. As years passed, the journal aged alongside the soldier. Pages filled, covers tore, and handwriting devolved. Some notebooks ended abruptly when campaigns intensified or when their owners disappeared from the war. Lesser known fact: historians studying recovered battlefield items often find diaries preserved inside waterproof map cases or ammunition tins. Eventually, the war ended, and many journals entered a long period of silence. Soldiers returned home carrying notebooks filled with experiences that few civilians could understand. The object that once lived in a uniform pocket moved into drawers, attics, and family boxers. Lesser known fact: after 1945, millions of veterans stored wartime documents without organizing them, leaving historians decades later to reconstruct their meaning. Old age of the wartime journal began when historians, families, and archivists rediscovered these notebooks. Each diary became a primary source, a fragment of personal history intersecting with global events. Scholars compared entries to official records to reconstruct battles from ground level. Lesser known fact: some military archives now maintain entire collections devoted exclusively to personal diaries of World War II soldiers. Replacement of the journal arrived in unexpected forms: tape recorders, video cameras, and digital devices eventually allowed soldiers to document experiences differently, yet none replaced the simplicity of pencil on paper. The notebook required no electricity, no batteries, and almost no space. Lesser known fact: modern military historians still rely heavily on handwritten diaries because they often contain observations missing from official reports. Legacy of the wartime journal stretches beyond military history. These notebooks influenced literature, psychology, and collective memory of the war. Personal voices changed how later generations understood the conflict. Instead of abstract campaigns, readers encountered individual days and emotions. Lesser known fact: many famous memoirs of World War II began as private diaries written during the conflict itself. Families often discover these journals decades later. A grandchild opens a box and finds handwriting from another era. The words reveal a person who once lived inside events described only briefly in textbooks. That moment becomes a bridge between generations. Lesser known fact: historians estimate that fewer than 10% of wartime diaries have ever been formally archived or published. What later military institutions learned from these notebooks is subtle but important. Official training programs began paying more attention to morale, rest cycles, and psychological resilience. The quiet testimony of soldiers influenced doctrine indirectly. Lesser known fact: modern armed forces often include structured psychological support programs partly inspired by lessons learned from World War II combat stress research. Designers of equipment and planners of logistics also gained insights from these diaries. Soldiers frequently recorded frustrations with gear, clothing, or rations. These complaints helped historians and engineers understand practical failures of wartime systems. Lesser known fact: complaints about cold weather boots in European diaries helped guide improvements in later military winter equipment. The journal leaves behind one final lesson about war and memory. Battles are measured in divisions, artillery, pieces, and kilometers of territory. But the smallest surviving evidence may be a page of handwriting written under poor light by someone who expected the morning to come, and sometimes it does not dot. In 1943, a U.S. Army survey quietly found that many infantrymen stopped writing letters home after roughly 60 days of continuous combat. Yet some continued writing in private notebooks long after that point. The life story of the wartime journal continues in that quiet persistence when communication with the world fades. The conversation with a blank page often remains. A notebook carried through war becomes more than paper. It becomes a container for fragments, sounds of vengeance, names of towns that no longer exist, descriptions of men who might not survive the week. Over time, the pages absorb mud, rainwater, sweat, and sometimes blood. Lesser known fact: paper exposed to constant moisture during the European campaigns often warped and curled, forcing soldiers to dry journals beside field stoves whenever they had the chance. The growth stage of the journal deepened as campaigns moved across Europe and the Pacific. Soldiers who had once written about training now described artillery barrages, long marches, and the strange rhythm of war days, of boredom followed by minutes of terror. Experience changed the tone. Words became heavier. Lesser known fact: Studies of battlefield communication show that artillery shells often arrive before their sound because shock waves travel faster than audible noise. Mass production of military equipment shaped daily life recorded in these. Diaries, trucks, rifles, radios, and rations appeared repeatedly in the pages. The war was industrial, and the soldier lived inside a machine of logistics. Lesser known fact: the U.S. Army operated more than 2.4 million vehicles worldwide during World War II, creating an enormous maintenance and fuel supply network. Standardization followed production. Weapons, ammunition types, spare parts, and field manuals became predictable across units. That predictability appears in dire descriptions of routine inspections and maintenance. War depended on repetition as much as innovation. Lesser known fact: the standard American infantry rifle, the M1 Garand, fired an 8-round clip that ejected automatically after the final shot, producing the famous metallic ping. Logistics expanded into something close to a moving city. Food arrived in crates, fuel in drums, ammunition in wooden boxers stacked like small buildings. A soldier's diary might mention trucks arriving at night or supply columns stretching for kilometers. Lesser known fact: during the Normandy campaign, Allied planners estimated that 1 gallon of fuel delivered to the front often required several gallons consumed during transport. Manuals attempted to impose order on chaos. Soldiers studied diagrams of weapons and tactics, but reality rarely followed the instructions perfectly. Diaries reveal how theory met practice under stress. Lesser known fact: infantry manuals of the period recommended squad spacing of 5 to 10 meters in open terrain to reduce casualties from explosions. The system around the soldier matured alongside the war. Field hospitals, repair depots, and communication networks improved over time. Even small comforts, such as hot meals or dry socks, appear repeatedly in diaries as treasured moments. Lesser known fact: the U.S. Army issued approximately 3 pairs of socks per soldier per week during certain campaigns to reduce trench foot and infections. By late stages of the war, the journal had become an experienced observer. The soldier, writing it, understood the patterns of combat, how artillery opened an attack, how tanks moved through gaps, how aircraft arrived after signals from ground units. The notebook captured a ground-level view of complex operations. Lesser known fact: close air support missions often relied on colored smoke signals so pilots could identify friendly positions. Peak moments of the journal often coincided with major offensives. Pages written during these operations describe confusion, smoke, noise, and the sudden disappearance of familiar landmarks. Entire towns vanished under bombardment. Lesser known fact: heavy artillery barrages during World War II could fire thousands of shells per hour during concentrated attacks. In one imagined but historically typical scene, a soldier writes in a ruined building after a day of fighting. The entry might be only 2 sentences long, the description of rain and the absence of a friend who marched beside him yesterday. The simplicity hides enormous emotional weight. Lesser known fact: casualty replacement systems sometimes assign new soldiers to frontline units within 24 hours of arrival in a combat zone. What made the journal effective during peak moments was its honesty. Official reports focused on objectives and positions. A diary recorded fear, fatigue, and uncertainty. The contrast reveals 2 different languages of war. Lesser known fact: psychological studies during the war discovered that soldiers often fought primarily for the safety of their immediate comrades rather than abstract national goals. The cost of carrying this journal emerged gradually. Writing about violent events required the mind to revisit them repeatedly. Some soldiers closed their notebooks permanently after witnessing traumatic scenes. Others filled page after page, trying to understand what they had experienced. Lesser known fact: the U.S. Army recorded over 900,000 cases of psychiatric casualties during World War II. Fatigue left visible traces in handwriting. Words slanted downward across the page as exhaustion set in. Sentences ended abruptly. The Bodhi struggled to keep pace with the demands of survival. Lesser known fact. Infantry soldiers often marched 20 to 30 kilometers in a single day during rapid advances. Fears shaped the entries in subtle ways. Soldiers wrote about whether food or minor repairs while avoiding direct descriptions of combat. Silence between lines became a form of communication. Lesser known fact. Many wartime letters and diaries deliberately avoided naming specific locations to prevent intelligence leaks if captured. Medical realities continued to appear in these journals. Soldiers described the sound of stretcher bearers moving through darkness, or the smell of antiseptic in field hospitals. War constantly reminded them of vulnerability. Lesser known fact. Evacuation chains during World War II could move a wounded soldier from frontline to surgical hospital in less than 6 hours under ideal conditions. Psychological strain accumulated slowly. Long exposure to danger altered sleep patterns and emotional reactions. Diaries recorded irritability, numbness, and moments of sudden sadness. Lesser known fact. Military psychiatrists observed that soldiers who could talk or write about experiences often recovered faster from acute stress. Weather continued to influence everything. Rain slowed vehicles, fog grounded aircraft, snow concealed mines. Soldiers wrote about the sky almost as often as about enemy forces. Lesser known fact. The winter of 1944-1945 in Europe was among the coldest in decades, contributing to equipment failures and frostbite cases. As campaigns ended, the journal entered the stage of old age. Its pages were filled, edges worn, and cover stained by months or years of travel. The soldier who carried it had changed profoundly from the person who wrote the first entry. Lesser known fact. Many soldiers destroyed portions of their diaries before returning home because they feared civilians would not understand the content. Demobilization moved millions of veterans back into civilian life. Uniforms disappeared, but notebooks remained. Some were stored carefully, others vanished into drawers and attic boxes. For years they remained silent. Lesser known fact. After the war, the U.S. military processed the return of roughly 8 million personnel to civilian status. Replacement of the journal came slowly with technological change. Tape recorders appeared in later decades, followed by cameras and eventually digital devices. Yet none fully replaced the quiet intimacy of handwritten pages. Lesser known fact. Historians often prefer handwritten diaries because they capture immediate impressions rather than memories shaped years. Later, legacy of the wartime journal extends far beyond the individual soldier. These notebooks helped historians reconstruct battles from the perspective of ordinary participants. They revealed details overlooked by official documents. The smell of fuel, the sound of distant engines, the tension before an attack. Lesser known fact. Some historians compare hundreds of diaries from the same battle to map emotional patterns across units. Later military doctrine quietly absorbed lessons revealed in these writings. Attention to morale, rest cycles, and mental health increased in post-war training programs. Commanders began to recognize the human limits of endurance. Lesser known fact. Modern armed forces often rotate combat units more frequently than World War II armies did to reduce psychological strain. The influence also reached literature and education. Memoirs based on wartime journals reshaped public understanding of the conflict. Readers encountered not just strategy, but individual lives, unfolding day by day. Lesser known fact. Many famous war memoirs, including those of infantry officers and medics, began as pocket notebooks written under battlefield conditions. Families discovering these journals decades later experience a moment of revelation. A grandfather who rarely spoke about the war suddenly appears in vivid detail through his handwriting. The notebook becomes a bridge between silence and understanding. Lesser known fact: archivists report that families still donate newly discovered wartime diaries to museums every year. What later generations copied from these journals was not the object itself, but the honesty it contained. Modern soldiers still record experiences in notebooks or digital notes, continuing a tradition that began long before electronic devices existed. Lesser known fact: some contemporary military training programs encourage reflective writing as part of stress management techniques. The final pages of many wartime journals are surprisingly quiet. After years of chaos, the last entry might simply describe a train ride home or the sight of familiar streets. War ends not with a dramatic sentence, but with an ordinary observation. A notebook closes, and the life story of that small object carried through mud, fear, and history comes to rest in silence.